Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in you, your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. I'm writing down a thought I had. Hold on. That's always dangerous when you start adding to your sermon on the fly, but we'll see how it goes. Landowners, vineyards, fences, wine presses, watchtowers. In both the gospel as well as our Old Testament lesson, that list represents the gifts that God has entrusted with certain people. They represent God's generosity and God's abundance. And the lament is because of the misuse of that abundance. The Isaiah passage is a love song, one which we might misconstrue with coming straight out of the Song of Solomon, because I think we always think of that as the book of the Bible that we hear love songs, but here it is, right from the prophet Isaiah. In each of these cases, both the Old Testament as well as the Gospel, God gives these gifts not as something to be hoarded, nor as something that made a certain people privileged over another, but rather this abundance was given to achieve God's purpose of putting this world back together. God shared gifts of peace so that that peace could be shared with all of creation. Both stories ultimately tell of a people who mismanage God's gifts. It seems to be the human story, doesn't it? The prophet Isaiah is speaking to the house of Israel, the Jewish people, reminding them that they were supposed to be that light on top of the hill as they embody that perfect law that the Lord had given them and the statutes that make the heart rejoice. The house of Israel was given the responsibility and the tools to be that light. They were the fertile soil and were supposed to produce good fruit. And yet, as the story goes, they mismanaged what God had given them. They mistook God's generosity for something that they had done or earned for themselves. They were entitled. Instead, they put these gifts and what they were supposed to be used for on the back burner. And in essence, they were rejecting God as the ways of the world took precedence to their agenda. In today's gospel lesson, we're hearing the second of three parables which form Jesus' response to the chief priest and the elders, questioning him about where his authority comes from. And they don't really want to know the answer. They already think they know, but they're out to get him. And their argument begins with his authority. Who do you think you are? And even though we hear Jesus speaking in parables, he's not mincing his words. Like the prophet Isaiah, Jesus is holding up a mirror to a certain people. And today, instead of the children of Israel, the house of Israel, Jesus is singling out these temple leaders and accusing them of rejecting God by rejecting the authority of the Son, the embodiment of God's own authority. By killing the Son, they thought that they could take what belonged to God and keep it for themselves. But it's important to remember that what these people were fighting for, this vineyard, Israel, just because others were entrusted with its management, the temple leaders were entrusted, the day-to-day working of the field and the harvesting of the fruit, that is, the teaching of the people of God to be that light on top of the hill, just because they were entrusted with that, didn't mean that they could take over the vineyard and do whatever they wanted to with God's vineyard. It wasn't theirs. They were entrusted with the management of it. It still must be managed as a landowner intended, not as whatever whim they have. It still must serve its purpose. It must produce good fruit, or what good is it? It's good for nothing. If salt loses its saltiness, what good is it, right? We've heard that. And yet, even in the midst of what seems like a bunch of bad news parables, it's just not going well for these people, Jesus does still deliver good news. The stones that the builders rejected are going to be the cornerstone of God's new vineyard. What was casted out as no good for anything is the foundation of what God builds on. And what the builders considered trash, the very thing that the builders were rejecting, Jesus the Son, was amazing in God's sight, and he was going to use him as that cornerstone of the new temple. Good news. Good news for us all. Now, while there are many themes that I could delve into and explore today, and opportunities will no doubt continue next week as we hear the third of these three parables, I am charged with a different task today. Today is the beginning of our stewardship campaign. And of course, that means I go in a certain direction. Today, I want to invite you to take in, with all your senses, our local vineyard, which has been entrusted to us. Look at the beautiful stone walls as you walk outside. The beautiful veneer inside, the magnificent crucifix, the stained glass windows, the beautiful sound from the organ and the choir that permeate through this space, the altar, all the beauty that accompanies this local vineyard. You, each and every one of you who are part of this vineyard. The massive bell tower that stands in our midst. Does that remind you of the watchtower in the parables? But this one rings out to our community, proclaiming the good news in familiar hymns, marking time. There are hedges also along the outside of our borders. Everybody can see where this vineyard ends, or can they? Any day that you come by here, you can see any number of the tenant farmers working the landowner's vineyard, stocking the little free pantry, doing the work of Noah's Ark thrift store, going out into the world proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ to the world, while working for that good fruit, which is righteousness and justice through our many ministries. No, this local vineyard is not Israel, but its purposes are still to produce good fruit. For that is the very and the only reason why we even exist. Exiting this parable for just a little bit and said plainly, St. Mary's exists for God's good purposes, not for those of us tenant farmers. And the good news is that we have been given and will continue to be given everything that we need. We are full. God has been with us and will continue to be faithful. And what remains to be seen is how will God's tenant farmers, the caretakers of this portion of God's vineyard, respond to all that faithfulness that God is showing us. Now, don't get me wrong. There are days when I have had some frank conversations with God, suggesting that maybe he should take better care of his roofs, Or maybe have some mortar that holds these beautiful stone walls up in a place that lasts a little longer than 120 years. I suggested that maybe the sewer line should go out to the road rather down in the building on the floors. This is just a list of some of the problems when we look at the glass half empty of owning such beautiful structures. And then somehow the response I keep getting is stop griping. I've given you everything that you need, God is saying. And not only that, take care of my vineyard with all that I've entrusted you with. You've got the resources. Take care of it. Do it yourself. Do my work and produce that good fruit. Yes, sometimes we all get overwhelmed with the responsibility. It seems daunting at times. Sometimes we do think in the negative. We can't help ourselves but think in scarcity rather than in the abundance that God provides. But really, has He ever let us down? We must remember that the church, any church, is more than just a building. And I don't mean that to sound trite. And the buildings are the tools that God gives us to help produce good fruit. They are not the end game. These churches exist to produce justice and righteousness while proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ and word and deed, and to come and rejuvenate ourselves and hear beautiful music and receive the sacraments, restore our soul. And at this particular church, God has provided us everything that we need to be successful. Because that success lies with you. All that needs to happen is for God's tenants to be faithful. We need you to be faithful with the things in which God has entrusted you. Be it a whole bunch or just a little bit. God has entrusted you. God's vineyard needs your time. Each and every one of you, whether you're sitting in this church or at home sitting or you're part of another church community, that community needs you as well. They need your time. God's vineyard needs your talent. God has given you such amazing qualities, and we're not all the same. Thank goodness, because this place would be a mess if we all were administrators, or if we all just had a wallet to pay somebody else to do the work. Well, who would do the work, right? We each have our gifts. And God's vineyard does need your talent and your treasure. Because your treasure is what keeps the lights on. It gets new mortar to put in the building. It puts new shingles on the roof. It pays salaries. It continues ministry so that we can bring the good news to the world. And there's even more good news. You don't have to do everything yourself. We're in this together. There are many tenants in God's vineyard, and we all have only been given a portion. So you don't have to do everything. You do have to do something. There is not one of us that has to give all our time or all our talent or all our treasure. Think about this. It all belongs to God anyway. He's just entrusted us, made us caretakers of some things for an amount of time, just a bit. As we get older, we know it becomes only too evident that we can't even do what we used to could do as a young person. So our time and our talent fade from time to time. And yet God still expects us to do the best we can, to give a portion. And when we are faithful, when we are generous, when our heart is in the right place and we don't expect anything in return as a reward because we deserve something or have earned something, I'll refer you back to the other parable of those tenants. It has been my experience that when we are faithful, God entrusts us with even more. But don't make this your end game, because then you're in a circle of trouble. Because it's not that we've earned anything, but rather because we have proven faithful and generous with what God has entrusted us. And in all that faithfulness, God's vineyard produces the good fruit that God expects. And that is the whole point that we exist in the first place. God's vineyard, churches everywhere. St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania, only exists so that it can produce that good fruit for which it was created for. Our faithfulness in this season, our faithfulness today, ensures a harvest that is full and abundant, not only for ourselves, but rather for the whole creation. We exist for others. St. Mary's is to be that light on top of the hill for all the world to see. And that inheritance, the one that the landowners, the workers thought that they had to steal and beat up the son to get. Well, it was ours in the first place. God entrusted us with it in the first place. And all we have to do is give a bit back. Faithful generosity. It's ours.